What did Nazi doctors do? They were part of what I came to see as a biomedical vision. Hitler in Mein Kampf wrote that the Nordic race is the only culture-creating race. All other races can sustain culture when it's been created by the Nordic race, and the, quotes, Jewish race, of which there's no such thing, only destroys culture, is a culture-destroying race. Therefore, the Nordic race had been very strong, but it had been infected by the, quotes, Jewish race, and something must be done to remove this infection. That was the language he used. He didn't say we had to kill them all, but they had to be dealt with in order to bring about a cure for the Nordic race. In that sense, his whole vision was racist and biological. One of the Nazi doctors I interviewed told me, I joined the Nazi Party the day after I heard a speech by a leading Nazi figure in which he said National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. Hitler and other leaders saw the whole process as a biological one, getting rid of the Jewish race, thereby curing the Nordic race and creating something like a biocracy in the way that priests would be the leaders or rulers of a theocracy. A biocracy would be run in the name of biological principles. It's a very good example of the dangers of claiming a kind of scientific, in this case, a biological truth for a genocidal project. So the Nazi doctors became part of that biomedical vision, killing in the name of healing, in several steps. There was first coercive sterilization. That wasn't unique to Germany. It was done in the United States and England and all through Western Europe. But there was a leading Swiss German named Ernst Rudin, who, as one of his followers told me, was a more fanatical geneticist than a Nazi. Nonetheless, he became a Nazi because the Nazis offered him a chance to get rid of all the bad genes, he thought, that caused mental illness and other harmful conditions. And therefore, that kind of sterilization could be done in the name of some kind of idealistic projection. And of course, there were no restraints. The practice could eventually be discontinued by law in democracies, not so in Nazi Germany. A second stage was the so-called euthanasia, or medicalized killing of children, so-called life unworthy of life, a concept that was actually created by a leading German psychiatrist and a jurist even before the Nazis. And one former Nazi doctor told me it was easier to kill very young children. He was involved on a ward and was involved actually in the killing, and he said they were given sedatives and it seemed like a putting to sleep more than an actual killing. A third dimension was the so-called euthanasia, or you have to have quotes around it. It's not really euthanasia, which has to do with helping the dying to die. This is the medicalized killing, or the medical killing in the third stages of adults, in which project they created gas chambers, and much of the mechanism and practices and indeed personnel for the concentration camps. And the head of that, at least the titular head, was a man named Karl Brandt, who was a very well-educated, kind of charming Nazi. I call these people, in quotations, you must have the quotation, but decent Nazis, with some kind of irony, because they were the ones who could sit next to at a dinner party, were very well spoken. They saw their mission as getting rid of the thuggish element within the Nazi movement, but they were ardent Nazis, and they did most of the work of the Nazis because they were the most able among the professionals, and that was Karl Brandt. In any case, they carried through this so-called euthanasia on adults. It was the only program that was protested and ever discontinued in Nazi Germany, because many families noticed that their family members who were mentally ill were being killed in this program and were disappearing. But even when it was discontinued officially, it continued unofficially, so it was never fully really stopped. Then there was another phase of bringing the so-called euthanasia program into the camps, and that would make an ordinary camp into a death camp, because people could be sent from a camp to a killing center. And then finally, of course, there was Auschwitz itself and other death camps, the genocide carried through. Doctors were involved in all of these stages, and the motto of the so-called euthanasia program was, the syringe belongs in the hand of the physician. But the syringe was a gas cock. The whole thing was medicalized and gave it a pseudo-medical therapeutic aura. In Auschwitz, doctors performed the selections at the ramp, which are well known and much reenacted in various places, and They also did, and in those selections, they were often very large scale, and thousands of Jews would arrive, the great majority of which, sometimes all of which, or up to 90% of which, never entered the camp. They were simply sent to the gas chambers without being admitted to the camp. Once Auschwitz became a death camp, it was only Jews who were selected. But they also did selections in the camp and in medical blocks to weed out those who were weakest in order to reinforce the slave labor contingent in the camp. Now, the chief camp doctor, Eduard Wirtz, was an idealistic physician. I write about him in my book. He was an idealistic physician who became an ardent Nazi, but he was a relatively decent man in those days who went out of his way to treat Jews when it wasn't quite legal to do that anymore. He was appalled by what he found in Auschwitz, but he was sent there because he had joined the SS and was an ardent Nazi, and it was thought he could help combat an epidemic of typhus in Auschwitz. He was horrified by what he saw there, but loyal to the Nazi movement and to the German military, whom he saw himself as serving. And after the war, he killed himself when taken into British custody. It may be partly out of guilt and partly out of a recognition that he had no future, because he would have been tried and put to death at Nuremberg or elsewhere. People like Wirtz had a conscience. It shouldn't be said that Nazi doctors or Nazis in general didn't have a conscience, but it was applied in the wrong place. It was applied toward loyalty to his comrades and to the Nazi movement rather than interposing it between himself and his victims, which is where a conscience belongs. And he's an example of how someone who had appeared to be a relatively decent doctor, in fact a very scrupulous one, could become a killer. I was able to interview his daughter, who was by then a middle-aged housewife, and I felt rather sympathetic toward her. She was struggling to understand how she had bounced on her father's knee, and she had loved him very much, and she discovered later on she was bouncing on his knee part of that time in Auschwitz. And at the end of our interview, she looked at me quizzically and said, "Dr. Lifton, can you answer a question?" I said, "Yes, what is it?" She said, "Can a good man do bad things?" And I thought about it for a while. I said, "Yes, I suppose so, but then he's no longer a good man." Nazi genocide, and the behavior of physicians in particular, was a mixture of idealism and terror. There was a Nazi projection of idealism. They told their doctors that you wouldn't be selfish one-on-one doctors, you would be doctors to the folk. You would be biological soldiers, you would be cultivators of the genes, you'd be contributing to the revitalization of your own people. On the other hand, they brutally destroyed all opposition and swept up all professionals through a pattern of what was called Gleichschaltung, which means re-gearing. And it really means not destroying professions, but destroying opponents and reconstituting the professions in a Nazi idiom. Now, how could Nazi doctors in an immediate psychological way do what they did? When I tried to answer that question, I came to a concept I call doubling, which I'll describe to you in brief terms, but it's a very important one, because what I believe happens in relationship to all genocide or mass killing is that the killers form what could be called a second self. They undergo a pattern of doubling, and doubling really means the formation of what is functionally a second self in an extreme environment, as happened in Auschwitz, so that Nazi doctors, for instance, in Auschwitz, would do all the things I mentioned, 6 days a week or whatever, and then they'd go from Poland back to Germany on leave for a long weekend or for 10 days or whatever, and be ordinary fathers and husbands. In Auschwitz, they would live from that Auschwitz self, whose norm was the killing functions they carried through, while they would be a father or a husband and live from the relatively more humane self which they had brought into Auschwitz. The doubling involves a certain degree of holism and autonomy. It's as if of course it's the same person, it's the same self, but the second self, the Auschwitz self, seems to be separate, to function as if it were a separate element from the prior self. And it has a more or less holistic function so that it not only enables one to adapt to the killing in Auschwitz, but also to the entire vulgar environment, the jokes, the heavy drinking, the entire style of existence in Auschwitz. It has a life-death dimension because perpetrators have to ward off death anxiety themselves, as they did. And of course it has a function of avoiding guilt, because that second or Auschwitz self takes on the dirty work, so to speak, for which one then needn't consider one's prior self or one's overall self responsible. And it can happen at an unconscious dimension, as well as a desire to adapt to Auschwitz, which most Nazi doctors had. The reason why they wanted to adapt to Auschwitz is because even though many Nazi doctors were horrified and experienced a lot of anxiety and indeed had nightmares over those first days in Auschwitz, they didn't ask to be transferred because it was late in the war and they knew that if they were transferred they'd be sent to the Eastern Front, where many Germans, including doctors, were being killed in very large numbers. So they adapted to Auschwitz. They had conflicts, but unfortunately they could overcome their conflicts sufficiently to carry out that murderous work. And part of the adaptation was a socialization process that saw them into the doubling, so to speak, in which more experienced Auschwitz doctors would go with them to their first selection, show how it was done, help them through it, explain to them that this is tough stuff, but we didn't create it, or maybe it's only temporary. Anyhow, we save a few lives by selecting them for the camp or to live in some way, and in that sense, help them to adapt to the overall process. Now, doubling is a form of what's called in psychological work splitting, separation of one portion of a self of the self from the rest of the self. It's also what was called by Pierre Janet, who was an early contemporary of Freud's, a form of dissociation. But the term doubling is useful because it suggests that there was an overall holistic sub-self, quite functional in that other environment. It helps us understand a lot of other situations. For instance, in terms of the famous Schindler, who has to be admired for what he did as a highly imperfect man, one could say that he stayed a Nazi. He went on drinking with his Nazi compatriots or comrades, even as his rescuer self got stronger and stronger. And finally, toward the end, it was the rescuer self that took hold more than the Nazi self. But that kind of doubling, in his case doubling toward a constructive dimension, can help explain his behavior. Without going into the psychological detail, a lot of the basis for this can be found in the work of Otto Rank and William James, rather than that of Freud. Now, doubling in this case enabled Nazi doctors to adapt to their killing process, but doubling can be life-saving as well, for a soldier in combat, for instance, or even for prisoners in Auschwitz, who also experienced an Auschwitz self which had to deal with much more brutal behavior, so that some Auschwitz survivors will say to you, I was a different person in Auschwitz, and one can virtually, literally understand that. And in doubling, there is a disavowal of what one does, so that for Nazi doctors, particularly if they were in some degree involved in the Nazi ideology, by and large, most Nazi doctors were not extreme ideologues. Mengele was an exception. They believed in the revitalizing promise of the ideology, which was very important. They could even laugh at some of its extremes. But they could disavow the part of the self that killed as doing the work of Auschwitz necessary to them in doing their job, so that what they experienced was not killing. So they knew what they were doing, but didn't take on the meaning of killing or the meaning of that reality. And that's what disavowal really means. In that sense, doubling is an adaptation to extremity, and it's an adaptation to evil, or it's a form by which, it's a pattern by which one can adapt to evil. Now, doubling also is undergone by lots of other people, other groups such as mafia members in American culture who might order the killing of many people and still be pillars of the community and give money to churches or community groups and really see themselves as pillars of the community. Or members of delinquent gangs can undergo doubling, or right-wing torturers or various kinds of terrorists can undergo a form of doubling that has parallels to what I've described. One can say that doubling is the psychological means by which one calls forth the evil potential of the self, and that evil is neither inherent in the self nor foreign to it. In other words, the point of view I'm taking is that we all have a potential for good and evil, and in various ways the potential for evil can be brought out. And however we explain the way in which that potential is brought out, we're still culpable, we're responsible for our evil. I've explained some of the process of doubling, but Nazi doctors remain completely responsible for what they did. Doubling helped enable them to do what they did, and their responsibility is sustained, at least in my way of looking at it. Now, it wasn't just doubling that enabled them to do what they did, it was the mechanism through which they could do what they did, but also there was the healing-killing paradox in Auschwitz. You had to kill people in order to allow some to survive in that selections process, and there was the extreme psychic numbing, as I call it, diminished capacity or inclination to feel, which Nazi doctors underwent, all the more since Auschwitz was such an extreme place, like a distant planet is the way that Nazi doctors described it. In that sense, what happened there, in a sense, didn't count. Also, the ideological fragments, that ideology of revitalization, that was enough to help them through this socialization to Auschwitz. And there was a kind of professional identity they sustained. Some of the reasons why Nazi doctors performed grotesque experiments in camps was because they wanted to keep their hand in as scientists rather than being only involved in killing functions. So they maintained a kind of fraudulent but psychologically significant sense of professional identity, even as they were killing people primarily. Nazi doctors, as with all of us, required a sense of meaning in regard to what they did, and this is a strange kind of finding. We are such creatures of meaning that Nazi doctors could go to their work every morning, they would tease their secretaries or assistants, they would make backbiting comments about their bureaucratic rivals, just as though they were part of an ordinary life-enhancing organization rather than at the center of a killing machine. A lot of the process had to do with the partial commitment to the ideology and the various kinds of socialization that I've been describing. In that sense, one can be socialized to evil and be a rather ordinary person who is socialized to evil if the genocidal institution has a strong position in one's society. One could say that there are certain institutions like Auschwitz which are atrocity-producing institutions, and they run on doubling. Auschwitz is unimaginable except for the doubling that its leading protagonists or its leading participants underwent. One can ask, did Nazis have to double? Well, they were Nazis after all, and Nazis are cruel, but I found that the arrival in Auschwitz was a dimension of evil that was shocking even to cruel Nazis, and they had to undergo some kind of socialization of the kind I described. One can also raise the question of whether doctors as a profession are more prone to double than others. Any of you in the audience who are physicians can remember how the very first day of medical school they thrust a corpse in front of you and they say, now go dissect it. That's supposed to be the first day of gross anatomy, but it's also a ritual that tells you you're now moving into the shamanistic world and you're moving into the world of death, and you've got to not flinch before death, so that doctors are encouraged to undergo considerable numbing and perhaps doubling as part of our profession. And there have been certain studies that show that many doctors go into their profession out of, or partly out of, their own struggles to cope with the fear of death. So it could be that doctors or others in so-called forbidden zones of death-related professions are more prone to doubling than others. But if that's so, then it's only a degree, and doctors merely show as a profession what everybody else can be capable of, but perhaps doctors a little more so. Is doubling a German cultural tendency? Because, we hear much about the doppelganger or various doubling patterns in German culture, and Otto Rank, who wrote about this, drew many of examples from German Romantic literature, and Nietzsche writes about the torn condition, Zerrissenheit, of the German soul, as have many others. And of course the Faust legend and Goethe's treatment of Faust, the famous classic of Faust, in which Faust says, in Goethe's words, "Two souls, alas, reside within my breast, and each withdraws from and repels its brother." That's a perfect poetic and clinical description of doubling. But when one looks into the matter further, one finds that the first writer, the first poet to take up the Faust theme was Christopher Marlowe, the British poet, and that there is doubling. There are novels and literature of doubling in all cultures. It would seem to be a universal proclivity which the Germans seized upon and which has strong expression in German culture. Now, there is a great moral paradox here, because doubling is part of the human repertoire for adaptation. That's our genius as human beings. That's why we've done so well so far in the evolutionary scheme of things, because we're marvelous at adaptation. But the moral paradox here is that this very adaptive process, if very successful in genocidal institutions and genocidal environments, can do us all in and end the evolutionary process. In other words, we use our adaptive skills for doubling as an adaptation to genocide, and genocide, of course, could end everything. Now, in my recent writings, and I spoke about this in an earlier talk, I'll just refer to it partially here, I've gone back to a concern about the resilience of the individual self. In having given you this message, we see all too much resilience in adapting to evil, but that same resilience also enables us to survive trauma and evil, learn from it, and illuminate that which we have survived. In that sense, I've developed a concept that I call the protean self. And the protean self, protean means many-sided. It's in all of us now. It has to do with our time historically, and it means a certain dimension of flexibility and many-sidedness and fluidity, which is a modus vivendi, which we require in our very protean world. And there's a kind of proteinism writ large at a macro level in the many changes that our world has undergone, including some great moments in the late 80s and early 90s of revolutions for freedom in Eastern and Central Europe, and the breakdown of the Soviet Union. All sorts of dubious things have happened since then, but we shouldn't forget these moments of what I would call protean transformation at a collective level and at an individual level. And what's of enormous hopefulness about the protean capacity that we have is that the protean self can become a species self. That is, we can take on, as we have at our better moments, a sense of self in a nitty-gritty way that is built from, importantly, a recognition that we are part of humankind. In that sense, we can still be an American or a Christian or a Jew or a Hindu or whatever. We can be a teacher, we can be a working person, we can be an athlete. But all of these sub-identities are subsumed to or part of a sense we have of being a human being. At our better moments, we have that, and this requires a sense of empathy. But the very genocidal process in our world, still so menacing to us, presses us toward species consciousness, species mentality, and species self. Once we recognize that our technological instruments can annihilate virtually every person on Earth, we experience what I call shared fate. We have a sense of kinship with every other self on the planet, because we recognize that we may all go down together if we don't pull together to survive. And that shared fate can be the beginning of a species mentality and species consciousness, and then there are various religious and secular leaders whom we can turn to who have articulated these ideas and are still in the process of articulating them. I can remember on a trip to the Soviet Union, which I made when it was still the middle of the Cold War as part of a delegation of Americans, worldwide physicians anti-nuclear movement, and there was a lot of things that weren't all that pleasant in our experience, but there was one moment that was unforgettable, and it was recorded on film, and we could see it again on film, in which we were at a large cardiovascular center, and it happens that the head of both delegations were cardiologists. It may be that cardiologists really have hearts. In any case, they examined in turn a very sick, elderly Russian man who clearly had advanced heart disease. And it was fascinating to watch them because at that moment, Russianness and Americanness disappeared. Even the whole mission of anti-nuclear protest, which we shared, that disappeared. These were simply two healers deeply concerned about a very sick fellow human being whom they might just be able to help survive if they put their efforts together. It's what I call a species mentality, and I've never forgotten that particular scene.